Today, let's look at lesson 9.4. We are going to solve quadratic equations by factoring. So in order to do that, we have to understand what this zero product property is. When we are given something like this, say we had A times B equals 0. If that's the case, then hopefully it makes sense that either A has to equal 0 or B has to equal 0. Because if two things multiply to equal 0, one of them has to be 0. We want to keep that in mind when we are looking at these problems down here. If I have two things multiplied together, like I do in problem 1, I have a binomial times a binomial. Notice that it equals 0. So, based off of our definition for the zero product property, that means that each of those parentheses that contain an x has to potentially equal 0. So that means x plus 8 has to equal 0, or x minus 2 has to equal 0. We're going to solve each of these equations. To get a positive 8 to the other side, we subtract. That means that 0 minus 8 is negative 8. So x equals negative 8 would be one of my answers. In the other equation, if x minus 2 equals 0, I'm going to add the 2 over to the other side. That gives you the x by itself. 0 plus 2 is 2. So because we had two different parentheses with two different x's, that means we have two answers. Same exact idea here in problem number 2. I see two parentheses being multiplied together. So we have a binomial times a binomial. Because that equals 0 and I want to solve for x, I'm going to take each parenthesis and set it equal to 0 so we can solve for x. So if we're looking at 2x plus 3 equals 0, I got to get those numbers away from x. We move numbers that are not attached first. So we subtract the 3. That gives us still the 2x. 0 minus 3 is negative 3. To get the x by itself, we have to undo that multiplication. So I'll divide both sides by 2. And so, sorry, I don't know why when I divide both sides by 2, that gives me the x by itself. Negative 3 divided by 2 is going to be a decimal if you put it into the calculator. I'd rather that you leave it a fraction. If you can simplify, then simplify, but 3 and 2 don't have anything in common, so negative 3/2 is my first answer. We still have this second equation. To get x by itself, I want to move that positive 1 by subtracting. That gives you x equals 0 minus 1 is negative 1. Once again, when I had two parentheses with two x's, that's why we have two answers. Notice that my next two examples, I don't see parentheses, which means the first thing we need to do is to factor to get it to look like the first two examples. Notice that we have this trinomial, x squared plus 7x plus 10 equals 0. Because there is technically a 1 in front and there are no variables with that 10, remember that means they don't have anything in common. There's no GCF, which means we want to follow the pattern of what is going to multiply to the last number, but add to the number in the middle. So if we're making a chart and finding things that multiply to 10, well, 5 times 2 multiplies to 10. If I add 5 and 2, that gets me that 7 that I'm looking for. So remember, we'll have our two parentheses being multiplied together. We want to start each of our parentheses with x because x times x gives us that 1x squared in my original problem. The 5 is positive, so we'll put plus 5. The 2 is positive, so we'll put plus 2. I don't want to lose the fact that this is an equation. It equals 0. So I still now have it equal 0. But what we've just created now looks like the first two examples. So I can take each of those parentheses, set it equal to 0, and solve for x. To get that positive 5 to the other side, we are going to subtract. So one of my answers, x equals -5. To get that 2 to the other side, we have to subtract it. That gives me the x by itself. 0 minus 2 is -2. So there are my two solutions. Looking at problem number 4, once again, if I don't see a number in front of the x squared, there's a 1. Since there's no variable with that 24, we don't have anything in common between those first three terms, so there is no GCF, which once again follows the pattern. We want to think about what is going to multiply to the last number, but add to the number in the middle. So this time we want to multiply to a -24. So if I want to multiply to a negative, one number is positive and one number is negative. There's quite a few numbers that multiply to 24. One of them is 6 and 4. So if I make the 6 positive and the 4 negative, there's my -24 when I multiply. Notice though, when I add these two numbers, it gives me 2. That's not the number that I have in the middle, which means we need to come up with two more numbers that can multiply to -24. Another combination would be 8 times -3. This time, notice that if I add those two values, it'll get me what I'm looking for. So 8 and -3 are what we want to fill in with our parentheses. Once again, notice that because my original problem says equal 0, I'm making sure that I say equal 0 with my factors. I start each of my parentheses with an x. I want a +8 in one of the parentheses, a -3 in the other. I then want to set each of those parentheses equal to 0 so I can finish solving for x. To move a +8 means we subtract. So one of my answers, x equals -8. In the other equation, we want to add 3. And so 0 plus 3 is 3. There are my two solutions. So go ahead and pause the video and come up with an answer for this checkpoint problem. Okay, hopefully you paused it and you have an answer. Remember, because this one's already factored, that means I can just set each of those parentheses equal to 0 and I can start solving for x. That -5 is not attached to the x, so we move that first by adding. That gives me 2x to equal 0 plus 5 is 5. But then I got to move the number away from the x. So I divide both sides by 2. If you put that into the calculator, 5 divided by 2 is going to give you a decimal. So like I mentioned in a previous problem, just simplify the fraction if you can. 5 and 2 don't have anything in common, so that will stay as it is. 5/2 is one of my answer. With the 4 and the 9, we move the number not attached, so we want to subtract 9 first. That gives me 4x to equal 0 minus 9, which is -9. To move that 4, we have to divide. If you put it in your calculator, -9 divided by 4 is not going to give you a nice even number there, so we're going to leave it as a fraction. They don't have anything in common, so we can't simplify. So once again, we have another fraction, -9/4.